In my previous video, I covered a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure game that came out on the PS2, but there is another. The worst selling JoJo game to be ever released, selling less than 50,000 copies. Published by Bandai Namco, but developed by Anchor Inc., which released games such as this. They also seem to have a side hustle too. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Phantom Blood released on the PS2 on October 26, 2006. It adapts the events of the first part of the popular manga series JoJo's Bizarre Adventure created by Hirohiko Araki. Just like the Capcom game, it never came outside of Japan, but having been released 4 years after it, you would expect some improvements over those years at least, right? Well, I went to this with very little knowledge of it, but the impression I got was quite negative. People do not seem to be fans of this game, which certainly would be backed up by the poor sales. I really expected the worst and thought I got it within the first couple of hours of the game, but eventually, as I understood the game better, I actually found myself having a lot more fun than I thought I would. There's definitely enough to criticize here, but there's also a lot of really neat things that are worth giving credit to. Once again, spoilers for part 1 of JoJo obviously, but this game doesn't include anything else from other parts. Alright, let's not waste any more time and start the game. We're greeted by a 3D cutscene of Aztecs doing a little blood sacrifice. It tells us all about how they ruled, until they didn't. This is actually a very faithful recreation of the Phantom Blood story. Of course, part 1 being only 44 chapters makes this feat a little less impressive, but I was surprised by how much they did include. Unfortunately, most of the story is told through these still images which aren't the highest quality. I mean, the 3D cutscenes aren't amazing either, but at least everything is voiced. The quality of the voice acting is another thing though. There are parts that are okay, but a lot of it doesn't sound great. The audio sounds like it was ripped from an 80s anime at times. The game's music also drowns out the voices sometimes. The character portraits can be very questionable too. It's very easy to say the Part 5 game was a lot more stylish and enjoyable to go through its story, but I will cut it some slack as Part 1's story is a lot harder to make exciting, especially if you compare it to every other JoJo part that came after it. This may not excuse the quality of it, but it serves its purpose of retelling the manga story. I won't really be focusing on the story to not drag out the video any longer than it needs to be, and you probably already know what happens. It did feel like a slog to go through all of it though, as you spend more time in cutscenes than you get to play the game, at least for the story mode. With the prologue done, we move on to chapter 1. We fast forward to Dio chatting with his dying father, and then JoJo jumps in to defend Arena from some bullies, and gets into our first fight of the game. Before each stage, you get an overview of your moves. As you go through the story, Jonathan's moveset will change and improve. The controls in this game are quite clunky though, and will take some time getting used to. Your options are quite limited at this part of the story, but most stages have some strategy that make it more bearable. I will explain mechanics as they appear in the story, and try to give some advice on how to beat each level too. Firstly, we have our health bar in the top left of the screen. The enemy's health is shown in the top center. The game has a mechanic where the red part of your health can be recovered over time. This is true for yourself and the enemies, making it generally better to focus on one enemy at a time. In the top right, you have your beat or combo meter, which is mainly used just for points. As for the controls, you move around with the left analog stick, you can move your camera with the right stick, pressing in the right stick will cycle through different zoom levels, square is your basic attack combo, triangle is a stronger attack that generally will stun opponents. It can be used in the middle or end of your square combo for different attacks too. Pressing either square or triangle while moving will do dash attacks. Circle does a roll in the direction you're facing, L1 is your guard which also centers your camera, and lastly, L2 will make you face the nearest enemy. The camera is easily the biggest enemy in this game though. It is so slow to turn, especially when you're moving, which is probably when you'd want to adjust your view the most. Generally, you want to keep L1 pressed at all times unless you need to run away. You can block most attacks in the game, and you are still able to perform rolls and punches while holding it. The second big tip would be to use L2 often to make sure you're facing the enemy straight on. So I didn't know this until after I finished the game, but you're not actually intended to win this fight. It makes sense looking back at it, it was strangely difficult. Having to face 2 enemies at once is bad enough to start, and they keep blocking most of your hits. Canonically, Jonathan does lose this fight, but while it may be tedious, it is very doable. If you keep blocking and not let them surround you, you can fight back after they finish their attacks. You may also notice another big issue with the game's combat. Most of your moves involve a knockback that grounds enemies. However, you cannot attack enemies on the ground. Paired with the health recovery, I'm sure you can imagine how lengthy the battles can become. A useful technique is to stop attacking before you perform your knockback move, and just repeat the first part of your combo over and over. Fighting like this speeds up the fights a lot. You can even buffer in your square inputs to make it easier. A lot of enemies are susceptible to this, but it does leave you quite open if there are other enemies. So we are supposed to lose here, but if you do win, there's an alternate scene that plays. In the end, Jonathan still gets beaten up by the bullies, and the story continues as usual. Moving on to chapter 2, where we meet our new brother Dio. Unfortunately, Dio takes Jonathan's existence personally, and we get into our next fight. Some of your moves change names, but it doesn't really matter as once again you're intended to lose this fight, and they make it a lot easier to do so. Dio will weave through most of your punches and counterattack. Your circle becomes a duck, making it basically useless. You can consistently hit him when he taunts or at the end of his free hit combo, but it's random which moves he'll perform, so it's likely most of the damage you inflict will regenerate. Unfortunately, the infinite loop strat of stopping your combos early doesn't seem to work on Dio. If you do want to go through the slow pain of beating him, you do get a different cutscene where Dio accuses Jonathan of hiding a rock in his glove. Chapter 3. Dio remembers his name, and we fight him again. The game has properly started, as from now on you actually need to win fights. You also have a time limit which will be present in every level now. Why did this game need a time limit? It didn't, but it's sure to cause you problems later on. If the time runs out, it's an automatic loss. With how the first two levels were made, I picked up some bad habits and played way more carefully than I needed at first. But you can be a lot more aggressive, as they won't just block all of your attacks. Dio will still dodge some of your attacks, but you can actually have a proper fight with him. This version of Dio can get stuck in the loop. Chapter 4. JoJo's dad is dying and Dio is suspected to be poisoning him, so we gotta throw hands with him again. Jonathan's moveset has improved slightly as he has grown up, but the battle itself is relatively the same as before. Chapter 5. Jonathan heads off to the horrific lands of Anno London and meets the one and only Robert E.O. Speedwagon, who shows him the true London hospitality by trying to shank and rob him. Here you get to truly experience how annoying it can be to fight multiple enemies. It is very easy to get hit by other enemies when attacking, so positioning is important. Thankfully, the other two goons are susceptible to the loop, making them quite easy. Speedwagon himself can be beaten by just spamming a normal combo. Even if the first few hits get blocked, he usually drops his guard eventually. Chapter 6. We return home and Dio had his own adventure and became a vampire. Our father dies and we have to fight off two cops who have been turned into zombies. Dio is also here fighting alongside them, but you can't defeat him. Some levels will have enemies you can't defeat or will infinitely spawn. You can tell who is the primary target by whoever's health bar appears on the top screen. This fight is a lot more annoying than the previous one. Undead enemies are a lot harder to kill. You essentially have to deplete their red health bar as opposed to just the green part like before, and they also recover health a lot quicker than living enemies. What I don't fully understand is that the red bar will stop shrinking after a certain point even if you're still attacking the enemy. I thought that something was broken each time it happened, but if you keep hitting them, eventually they will go down. You are equipped with a spear for this battle, meaning your moveset is different once again, but the zombies are easy to take down. The biggest obstacle is only really Dio getting in the way and interrupting you. On my second playthrough, with certain strats, they were incredibly easy though. Chapter 7. The house burns down, so Dio decides to cool down by taking off his shirt and fighting us. Now we get to have a proper battle. Dio fights smarter than in the previous few battles, so a more defensive style is better here, and he can heal himself as an undead. You can, however, set him on fire by knocking him into the flames, which will deal some damage and stop him from healing for a brief time. I don't recommend fighting too close to the edge though, as if he gets far enough out of the arena, your attacks won't connect. Dio is a little too smart to get stuck in the loop, but I found using the square triangle move being pretty good here. It will make him go up in the air, after which you can do a normal full combo. We beat Dio's ass once again and continue the story. Chapter 8. About half an hour of cutscenes later, Zeppeli shows up in his pride hat and teaches us Hamon. This is where the game actually starts. Triangle now essentially becomes your Hamon button. Pressing it by itself will make Jonathan punch the ground and release a ripple outwards that will stun enemies for a short time. It is incredibly broken and useful throughout the whole game. Your combos will also do different Hamon infused attacks when triangle is pressed. Using Hamon on the undead is how you stop them from recovering health and defeat them a lot quicker, in addition to stunning the enemy. Under your health you will have a Hamon gauge. Using these Hamon moves will deplete some of it, and once empty, you won't be able to perform these moves or they'll just be weaker. You will also notice a rippling circle in the top left that will fill up as you defeat and fight enemies. Once full at max heat, you can press R2 to do a special attack on an enemy that will require you to spin the right analog stick. The more you fill up the bar, the stronger the attack. In Jonathan's case, the attack is a disappointing sunlight yellow overdrive. You cannot skip the cutscene for it, by the way, which did make me not want to use it as much, but it's a pretty decent free extra damage. R1 is another really broken move that I found very helpful throughout the game. Holding it charges the gauge in the bottom right, up to level 3, releasing it does a powerful attack in front of you. I essentially kept this button held down for the entire game. The only thing that cancels it is being knocked to the ground, trying to use it whilst blocking, or holding the level 3 charge for too long. The last one will also lock you from using it for a few seconds. Sometimes, even when the enemies start hitting you, you can release the attack to get out of the combo, and it can be used at the end of your own combos. It's really great and makes things a lot easier. You can also do a counter with circle. It might seem strange that it takes some of your health when you do it, but you can recover it, and it also stuns the enemy when you do it. The biggest benefit of this is that it can be activated even in the middle of attack chains, making it a good way to get out of trouble easy. Pretty much just mash it when you start getting hurt and you might come out safe. And lastly, the X button, which can be held down to recharge your Hamon gauge. You can also press X during your combo. Besides replenishing your gauge a little, it will also give you different buffs depending on how many square inputs you have done before it. The buffs are health recovery, defense, attack, and speed. They can also stack. While that already sounds great by itself, it also makes getting enemies stuck in the infinite loop easier as it eliminates your final knockback move. Now, I wouldn't say all of this makes this a good game, but I did have a lot of fun trying to find what's the best way to cheese things. I don't think this game is difficult, as most missions didn't take me more than 2 or 3 tries at most, but with how annoying fights playing normally can get, I definitely recommend incorporating some cheese in your battles. As for the fight itself, it's Dio's little sidekick Wong and a few zombies. You only need to defeat Wong, so go and play around with your new abilities. Pretty simple stage. Chapter 9. The gang gets trapped in a tunnel by Jack the Ripper, and this time it's Zeppeli's time to shine. He controls the exact same as Jonathan, but obviously has his own variations of moves. The strategies are pretty much exactly the same though. His triangle is not as broken as Jonathan's, but he has his own Hamon AoE as one of his combos. Since he is a Hamon user, this shouldn't be a hard fight, and it's very similar to the previous one. Jack has a few zombie friends, but you only need to beat him to progress. Chapter 10. Jonathan decides it's as good a time as any to start becoming an alcoholic and asks for a glass of wine. It's time to fight Jack the Ripper again. Thankfully, we don't need to worry about spilling the wine as it's here just to help you detect Jack. If you use X to charge your Hamon, it will act as a sonar to tell you where Jack is as he will be running around the stage like crazy. He also has a big Iron Maiden that he holds that will make it difficult to hit him normally. The best way is to charge up your R1 move and hit him while he's running. It will do a lot of damage and you don't need to worry about him counter-attacking. You can also use triangle to stun him for a little. Hit him with the zoom punch a few times and get rid of him for good. Chapter 11. This is an actual cutscene from the game.
気をつけろ。何者か襲ってくるぞ。いただきだぜ、ウスノロども。
Now, I can't imagine this is how the cutscene was intended. Poker's face is easily the most terrifying thing in this entire game. This isn't a child. This is an eldritch beast speaking to you telepathically. Let's just forget we ever saw this and move on to the gang encountering Dio. We have a basic mission where you have to defeat 20 generic zombies. The time limit is easily the biggest challenge here, especially if you're still trying to get used to the game's new mechanics. Triangle stun and charging your R1 should get you through it as always. Just keep your Hamon meter in mind. Chapter 12. Zeppeli and Dio discuss their calorie intakes, and we have to defeat 15 more zombies. It's pretty much the same fight as before, but this time Dio is here to annoy you as well. He can freeze you with some of his attacks as well as by simply guarding your hits, but if you have your R1 charged, you can break out of it immediately. Only the zombies count, so focus on them, but feel free to show Dio some love if he becomes a little too needy. We defeat the zombies and move on. Chapter 13. Dio summons Tarkus and Bruford, which leads us to easily the worst level in the whole game. Of course, every good beat 'em up needs a water level, and the boys at Anchor Inc. don't disappoint. Your moveset is severely reduced, and so is your movement. Your Hamon gauge is being constantly drained unless you're near one of the bubble spots, and if it depletes completely, your health will start draining. The first thing you want to do is make your way to one of the bubble spots, or more accurately, get pushed into one. Then just hang around there for the rest of the stage blocking. Bruford can do 1 or 2 attacks. One will knock you away a little bit too far, but the other will give you a chance to counterattack. I recommend the square-square triangle combo as it has a wider hitbox. Once you fill up your heat meter, you can use R2 on him to end the fight early. There really is nothing fun about this fight, and I would have been fine if they skipped it completely and just given me more still images of the story instead. Chapter 14 brings it back though with a proper fight against Bruford. He's got some pretty cool moves, but once again, with the triangle attack, he becomes wide open to a full combo, while you charge your heat gauge and R1 move for extra damage. 1v1 fights are generally very easy, especially with Hamon. As there are no extra enemies to annoy you here, we win without much trouble and Jonathan gets entrusted with Bruford's sword, luck and pluck. Although it looks more like it's saying Luguk and Pluguk. Chapter 15. Best Boy Speedwagon wants to help out, so he brings us to another not so fun stage. You have to get to the end of the stage beating zombies along the way. This mission is probably the worst in terms of time limit as Speedwagon doesn't have Hamon, meaning it takes longer to defeat enemies. The R1 button is your savior here. The attack is very strong and helps finish off zombies quicker. Just make sure you don't get knocked down too much and that you're not blocking when using the R1 attack so you don't waste it. Running around the stage or blocking until your R1 move charges up is a strategy you can use on most levels, to be honest. The enemies aren't a huge deal, but you will need to defeat them all to progress through the level. Try to get as many enemies as you can with your R1 attack. The fully charged one will basically insta-kill anything it hits, but it does take a while to charge up. Blocking and using L2 to phase enemies is very helpful here. Don't forget your R2 move once the gauge fills up too for a free kill. At the end, a few more enemies will spawn, and after beating enough of them, we get to proceed. Chapter 16. Zeppeli rushes in to help Jonathan, who is having some trouble fighting Tarkus. Understandably, because even his model is huge. This fight was going very well, until he did this. Yeah, if you haven't been using the circle counter up until this point, you will learn to love it here. Many of his attacks are multi-hit, and each hit can be countered, meaning even if you just mash circle, you will be able to counter and escape them. And you can buff up your recovery rate to make up for the health lost using counters too if needed. Tarkus can be pretty annoying to fight, but he can also be bullied with the R1 attack. A weak version of it will be enough to stun him and give you enough time to use a full combo or get a buff. In fact, you can use R1 while he's still hitting you most of the time, meaning you don't even need to counter. In conclusion, believe in the R1 button and let it lead you to victory. Chapter 17. This time you're fighting as Jonathan against Tarkus and his two new buddies. They're just here to annoy you and cannot be taken down. Same strategy as in the previous mission, only this time you get to have your good triangle move, which is useful in stunning the two zombies so they don't get in the way. Besides that, ride that R1 button to another sweet victory. Chapter 18. Zeppeli gets too old for this shit, so we say our goodbyes and make it to the village, which is overrun with zombies. We go up against Mr. Adams and a band of infinitely respawning zombies. It's not a difficult fight, but for some reason, the main enemy will just lie down on the ground if you deplete his health bar until it recovers before getting back up. Since you can't hit enemies on the ground, you just have to wait until he gets back up. The fodder zombies shouldn't be any trouble though. Immediately after beating Mr. Adams, another fight starts against the mysterious man who turns out to be Dyer, one of Zeppeli's old Hamon buddies. He is much better at dodging your attacks and can dish out decent damage himself, but like everyone else, they can't resist the triangle stun. By now, it should be pretty easy to see how you can cheese this game to make it incredibly easy. Even if you make mistakes and take damage, you can recover most of it easily. In the event that you do actually lose this fight, you will have to repeat the previous battle as it's the same chapter. Anyway, we beat Dyer and meet up with Zeppeli's other fellow student Straits, as well as his master Tom Petty, who join our group. Chapter 19. After a bit more story, we finally make our way to Dio's castle. We fight against Doobie and a bunch of respawning weird hybrid creatures Dio created. Doobie can, and most likely will, poison you with his attacks. When poisoned, you start glowing green and slowly lose health, as well as losing any stat buff you acquired and taking more damage when hit. It's not as bad as it seems though, more of an annoyance than anything, and will go away by itself after a short while. The other enemies also shouldn't pose any trouble, as I found them to be a lot less aggressive than normal zombies. Use your usual strategies to take him down and proceed further inside the castle. Chapter 20. Defeat 10 generic lizard zombies. Not much else to say here besides the fact Dyer embarrasses himself completely with his attack on Dio. Chapter 21. Dyer's last attempt at attacking Dio does give Jonathan an idea to use a Hammond-infused sword as a weapon, but before that we have to defeat the needle vein zombies as Straits. Like Zeppeli, he has access to all of the same types of abilities as Jonathan, and he's probably my favorite character to play as. His triangle stun feels even quicker than Jonathan's, and in general, he has some really cool moves. Because of that, this fight shouldn't be hard either. The stun gives you a lot of time to play around with all the new moves he has access to. After beating the 4 zombies, we get thrown right into the fight against Dio. The newly equipped sword does have the beneficial effect of being able to hit Dio when he's guarding without getting frozen, but it makes everything else pretty much worse. First of all, your triangle now only shoots several roses in front of you, similar to Zeppeli's triangle, but even worse. Your combos are also limited, which in turn limits the stat boost you're able to trigger. Only recovery and defense can be buffed as your combo just isn't long enough to perform any more hits. Thankfully, you still have the R1 and L2 moves, which I recommend using as Dio has a lot of health. At least the enemies aren't too much trouble here. Taking things slow is good if you're having problems. You should have more than enough time to whittle down his health bar. I do recommend getting a hit in before using your R1 charge, and especially the L2 overdrive move, to make sure it connects and doesn't get wasted. On my second playthrough, I was actually able to get him stuck in a one-hit loop as well, so there are definitely ways to cheese this fight as well. We slice Dio in two, which is more of an inconvenience to him than anything else, and move on to the final fight against Dio. Chapter 22. Jonathan ditches the sword and Dio is joined by 2 lizard zombies instead, who are a lot more annoying and can poison you. You get a tip saying how you can light your hands on fire by punching the flames outside, which will allow you to attack Dio without getting frozen. The fire doesn't last forever, so you will need to go back to gain the effect again. All of this can make the fight quite annoying, but at least you have your triangle stun, which will give you a little piece to set yourself up. Make sure to keep an eye on your Hamon gauge so you don't run out, and use your special moves when available. This fight will probably be very easy without the extra enemies, but the fact we don't get a proper one-on-one duel for our final fight with Dio is a bit disappointing. Anyway, after a tough fight, we finally defeat Dio and throw him off a cliff, never to be seen again. Chapter 23. After such a bizarre adventure, Jonathan and Irina get happily married and are going to America on a ship when JoJo spots one of Dio's old zombies. We have one more fight against Wang and the decapitated head of Dio before the story truly ends, and unfortunately, it is a bit of an annoying one to finish things off. First of all, Jonathan has been gravely injured and is unable to breathe properly, so you aren't able to charge your Hamon gauge. This also includes no stat boosts. You do start with a full meter, but once it's empty, that's it. You move very slowly too, so rolling is pretty much the only way to get anywhere. To add insult to injury, Wang has a bunch of zombie friends to make things even more tedious. Thankfully, you don't actually need to defeat Wang properly, just use your R2 special move on him once it's fully charged up to finish the fight early. You can beat him normally, but that's way too much effort than it's worth. The best way is to beat up the zombies that are with him to charge it up, but it's not as easy as Dio loves to spam his laser eyes, which will always knock you down to the ground, even if you're guarding. Beating the mission itself is not too bad thanks to the R2 move, but even with that, it's hard to get a good rating at the end, as chances are you will get knocked down a lot. So I haven't talked about a rating system in the game, but that's because it hasn't really been relevant until now. It's honestly nothing special. You get a letter grade for a bunch of different things such as time taken to beat the stage, remaining health, your max speed or combo, the amount of times you have been knocked down, amount of stat boosting poses used, and enemies defeated. All those grades are then combined into one final grade, and you receive points that contribute to unlocking extra stages after beating the game. These conditions are pretty arbitrary, especially the poses used just means you have to waste time posing a bunch of time to make the game happy. Also, best attempts are not tracked. You cannot check anywhere what grade you got on a certain stage, so it's pretty easy to ignore. If you want points, you can just replay any mission to keep grinding them out. It's not an issue in the slightest. I wouldn't really care about it at all if it wasn't for this specific mission. It's the only one like it, but if you manage to get an S rank on it, you will unlock an alternate version of the stage where you fight Dio, who has taken over the body of a priest alongside 3 other legendary knights, which I won't try to pronounce names of, but have been briefly referenced in the manga. I will speak more about them later, but this is a pretty tough mission. Of course, if you got to this point, you should know how to abuse the game's mechanics to take him down, and you will have a chance to practice fighting the other 3 knights in another mode. It's a shame the unlock requirements are so difficult, because despite playing through everything this game has to offer, I was not able to get anywhere near S ranking the original Mission 23, and had to resort to using a completed save file to show it off. By the way, there is a chapter select in this game that lets you replay any chapter you've already completed. However, you won't be able to unlock this secret mission if you replay it from chapter select. It has to be done in story mode, although pretty much this same fight can be unlocked somewhere else without the story. You get a few different cutscenes in here, but in the end, Jonathan's fate remains the same and he dies on the boat clutching Dio's head whilst Irina hides in a coffin to escape the burning wreckage. We get a couple more cutscenes and conclude the apparent story of the Stone Mask. Despite being responsible for a lot of the events in the story, doesn't really feature much. Then we roll credits showing stills from the game. Now that we finish with the story, the real fun starts. This game features a lot of extra content which honestly is a lot better than the story mode, although if you do want to give the story mode another go, a lot of the missions will now let you play as alternate characters. They do try to make it fit with the context of the story, so your choices are restricted to whoever is traveling with JoJo at that point, but it's still neat. Now let's go to the museum, which contains 5 options. First is Profiles, which just contains flavor text giving some more context to characters at different points of the story. In theater, you can watch all cutscenes from the story mode. Extra battles are where things get interesting though. It contains 32 fights where you play as pretty much every character in this game. It's almost incredible how many playable characters they fit in this game. A lot of them will let you select from a range of characters, but you can play as the Ripple Warriors, enemies, bosses, even the bullies from the first chapter and the Aztec Chief from the prologue. The combat system is not that deep, so most of them are fairly basic and play pretty similarly. There is no free battle system, so you are restricted to the characters they give you, meaning most of them only have one mission you can play as them, but it's still an incredibly cool thing. Despite having no story or dialogue to them, there are kind of what-if scenarios, which really shows the team behind the game had passion for the project. I've seen some conflicting information on how exactly new missions get unlocked, but for these extra battles, it seems to be the total points you have. Also, the final fight here is the exact same as the secret chapter 23, minus the cutscenes. But you do have the option of playing as different characters for it, so you're not missing out much by not S-ranking the original story fight. Next up is the 77 Rings Night mode. This refers to a challenge that was mentioned in the JoJo manga. Only 5 knights were said to have survived it, 2 of them being Tarkus and Bruford. This is a battle gauntlet where you have to defeat 77 zombies, which also includes the 3 other knights that completed the challenge, and you may remember from the secret mission. One of them will spawn after beating 30, 50, and 70 enemies. The other zombies are fairly standard, so while the bosses can be a bit rough, it's not a difficult challenge and you will be doing it many times if you want to unlock everything. At first, you can only play as Jonathan, but every time you complete the mode, you will unlock another character. This is the closest this game gets to a free battle mode. The characters are split into 2 groups, the first being the Ripple Warriors consisting of Jonathan, Speedwagon, Dyer, Straits, Tom Petty, Jonathan with a sword, and Jonathan in a tux. All of these should be quite easy to use as they have Hamon, except for Speedwagon. It took forever to kill the bosses playing as him. I genuinely thought the game was broken again, but no, it's just how the undead bosses do. The second group consists of the game's villains. You can play as Wang, Jack the Ripper, Bruford, Tarkus, Mr. Adams, Doobie, Dio, and Wang with Dio's head. Having no Hamon is rough, but as an undead, you finally get to abuse the mechanic of being hard as hell to kill. Most of the characters do still have pretty good movesets. For example, you can poison enemies as Doobie, or play as the massive Tarkus, all except Mr. Adams. He absolutely sucks. Some characters, like him, have a dash attack that brings you to the ground, which cancels your R1 charge. The R1 is your biggest saving grace when using any of the weaker characters. Because there is no time limit, you can just run around the stage charging your R1 to level 3 and turning back just to unleash it. It's especially useful if you're playing as Speedwagon or Mr. Adams, or just aren't used to the boss's moves, which can be quite strong. Overall, it's a pretty fun mode. And lastly, we get Dio mode, which you get for unlocking all extra battles. This is essentially a set of 16 more battles that represent Dio's side of the story. Like in the extra battles mode, the only context you get is the titles as they contain no cutscenes themselves and are just simple fights. You play as all the versions of Dio that you fought in the story, which is pretty cool. He's incredibly strong. You might remember how as a vampire his block would create ice around him that would freeze anything that tries to touch him. Well, actually, his guard is even more broken than that, because even before he turns, he will automatically counter any hits he blocks. This also is a pretty fun mode to go through. I found a very satisfying combo you can do by using your weak R1 move to open up the enemy, then use square triangle to launch the enemy upwards. This will let you do a full square combo, then you can use another R1 move before they fly out, letting you do a whole nother full square combo. The last mission has you playing as Wang with Dio's head against Jonathan, who's accompanied by a priest and 2 policemen. I guess this still counts as a version of Dio. Strangely, despite this game making almost every character playable, the priest is not one of them, despite appearing in the battle and being used by Dio. And that about covers everything that this game has to offer. While it started rocky, I ended up enjoying this game a whole lot more than I ever expected. Granted, that fun was mainly from me trying to find new ways of breaking the system and cheesing the fights, but it was fun nonetheless. For an inexperienced company, I think they put a lot of effort and passion into the project, and whilst it might not be a fantastic game, they made sure to pack it with a lot of fan service to make anyone who is a fan of Phantom Blood happy. If you aren't a big fan though, this may not be for you. It's difficult for me to say which game is better when comparing this to the Golden Wind game. The Golden Wind game definitely has a lot more style and unique mechanics in its combat and missions, but it also has a lot of moments that were dreadful to play. Whilst here, I pretty much played every single thing I could. Golden Wind has the benefit of covering a more unique and longer story, so I will give the Phantom Blood game some credit for covering a more challenging part of JoJo. In the end, they both have their individual strengths, and if you enjoy the content they're based on, they're only several hours long. This game took me less than 6 to beat the story, and only 1 when replaying it while skipping cutscenes. So, if you have a chance, give them a shot. Just keep in mind, they are licensed anime games in the end, and are here more just for the fun of it. Thank you for watching this video till the end. I hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment with your thoughts on this game and which one of the 2 PS2 JoJo games you think is better. Like and share it with anyone who you think might be interested in learning more about this game. I'm currently working on another video covering anime games based on a certain gambling series, which I'm really excited to get out there, so I hope to see you there. Anyway, take care for now.